Welcome students to our automatic transmission service and repair lesson. We're starting to get to the end of this course. We've went through, if we go through all, we went through introduction and history, kind of introduced you to the automatic transmission. We talked about the history to the automatic from our Hydromatic in our 1940 Oldsmobile to our now 10 speeds, and they even Ford and Honda are talking about putting out an 11-speed transmission. Talked about why we want multi-speed transmissions. Then we got into the hydraulics, the torque converters and hydraulics, kind of the heart of how an automatic transmission or transaxle works. Then we got into the internals, the key components, what we'd find in our transmissions. We're talking our gear sets and our clutch packs and bands. We got into the electronics of a transmission and diagnosis of a transmission. Now we're going to do our service and repair. It's kind of building up as we go through all these lessons to give you a basic understanding, a greater grasp of how automatic transmissions and transaxles work, and give you a starting point on how to diagnose and repair these units. In most shops, the service part is very common. Maintenance on transmissions, changing the fluid and filters, making adjustments that are needed. Those are real common. The actual overhaul of transmissions, a light repair like replacing solenoids or valve bodies, something you can do in the vehicle is something you may do in a shop, but the actual overhaul, you don't do that in many shops. Most shops just prefer to get rebuilt units and let a manufacturer cover the warranty. However, there are some shops that still rebuild them. The shop I was at in Manhattan, before I moved down here, we rebuilt a lot of transmission. We still got some through a rebuilder, but we rebuilt a lot of them. We also rebuilt a lot of our own engines, just because we'd kind of gotten a reputation of doing that, and we had so much trouble with getting rebuilt units that didn't cause us problems. Couple places here in Emporia would be Troy's Transmission and Meenan's Transmissions are guys that are still rebuilding transmissions. But for the most part, rebuilding is not what you're going to do in a shop. But to go through them is important to help you understand failures when we're trying to diagnose them. And also being able to go through them on your own vehicles. It'll save you a lot of money if you can rebuild transmissions yourself, whether you want to rebuild your own or if you get into a shop that rebuilds transmissions. So as we go through this lesson, we'll kind of touch on this. I stress to watch these videos. Get you a good grasp and understanding how to rebuild these transmissions and transaxles. I picked transaxle because internally clutch packs, bands are very similar to transmission, but we also have the final drive unit and the transaxle. And then once you get an understanding how to do a service and overhaul a transmission, you're that much closer to having a good grasp of automatic transmissions. So our basic objectives, we're going to talk about correct procedure for replacing the filters on transmission and transaxles. More and more transaxles and transmissions are not coming with replaceable filters, but there are still plenty out there that do. We're going to talk about fluid flush and refill procedures. There's a big, or has been a big, for a long time, big debate whether you should even flush transmissions, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about procedure for adjusting bands on transmissions. Even though most transmissions nowadays do not have adjustable bands, there are some older transmissions out there that do, and it's not a difficult procedure, but to have a basic grasp how to do it is important. And then linkage adjustments. The most common one is our shifter linkage, but on older transmissions it may have a throttle valve or a kick down cable. That linkage is also important to make sure we check. And then we'll just kind of describe some basic key steps for transmission overhaul. Again, make sure you watch those videos because that'll give you a good understanding, get a good view of transmission overhauls. This was something I'd planned for probably a couple weeks of class time, being out in the transmission lab, taking transmission and transaxles apart and putting them back together. Again, I think that's important to understand how they work, and even if you don't get into rebuilding them, it helps you understand them so you can diagnose them better. Okay, when we're talking about service of an automatic transmission or transaxles, it's not like engine oil to where we have to change filter and fluid every 3,000 or 5,000 miles. Okay, they can go much longer than that. However, here it says several surveys of transmission shops have shown that over 80% of transmission failures were the result of neglecting to change the fluid. I would have to support that 100%. I don't have any scientific evidence to that, but in my experience, many times we get a transmission in slipping, or they're having shifting problems, and it's either really low on fluid or we really got really old fluid in it. Again, if we remember from our lesson on automatic transmission fluid, there's a lot of different additives in this, including friction modifiers, that over time, age, these break down and they don't work like they're supposed to. And then we start to see transmission failures. Clutches and bands don't apply like they're supposed to. It doesn't shift like it's supposed to. And we get many failures from just a lack of maintenance on the automatic transmission. Manufacturers, I feel, have not helped that. They keep extending the warranties. The service intervals on when to change your fluid. It's not odd to get into a manual or service information and they don't even have a recommended fluid and filter change. You even see some units that are considered sealed units that you don't change the filter or fluid. To me, you're just asking for problems. You have mechanical wear. So it's important that we pay attention to the maintenance of a transmission and make sure our customer is aware of that also. Some different ways we can service our transmission is we can change the filter and refill the fluid with the filter. If we got a transmission with a pan on it, or a transaxle with a pan that can come off with the filter underneath it, and we'll talk about some different steps. I have a video up there that kind of shows how to do it. You can drop that down, put a new filter in, put a new pan on, gasket on, put the pan back in, refill it. This is what was done for many, many years. There's not necessarily anything wrong with this. The problem with just doing this is you're only replacing maybe a quarter or a third of the fluid. The torque converter holds a lot of fluid. You don't get the fluid out of the torque converter by doing a method like this. Now there are some transmissions that have drain plugs on the torque converter. Ford on their AODEs or the 4R70Ws and the E4OD, or another name for that is the 4R100. On some of those older ones, there was a drain plug on the torque converter. Matter of fact, John Caruso Ford, which I think was a 2003, had a drain plug on the torque converter. In the old days, on older 3-speed transmissions, you could actually drill a hole in the torque converter, drain it, tap it, and put a plug in it, a little 1/8" pipe plug. That was not uncommon to do, just so you could get all the fluid out of the torque converter. Because if it doesn't have a torque converter drain, and again, if it's the newer transmissions with a lockup torque converter, you don't drill those and put a plug in those. You run too high a risk of drilling into that lockup disc, that torque converter clutch disc. But that is the drawback of changing just the filter and fluid. If it doesn't have a filter, which many don't, especially your transaxles, usually on most of them it has a drain plug and a fill plug. You take both those plugs out, you drain it, put the drain plug back in, fill it through the fill plug, get it all warmed up, check your fluid level just like you would any other time. That's the same with our transmission fluid and filter change. And then go about your business. Same problem with that is what we get with just changing the filter. You're only getting a third or quarter of fluid, new fluid, back in. It's better than nothing, but that's all you're not getting the full fluid change in there. Now on those drain and fills, or if you have a filter, transmission with a pan and a filter, and you have a drain plug in it, you can service your transmission, put the filter in it, but on both those, you can drain it, fill it, run it, drive it through all the gears, drain it, fill it, and do that about 3 or 4 times, and then you'll get a more complete fluid change in your transmission. But that can be very time consuming doing it like that. And if you got a transmission with a filter and a pan, many times you don't have a drain on that. So dropping the pan down every time just wouldn't be very cost effective. Okay. There are fluid exchangers. This is where we do. This is our transmission flush systems. Many technicians, especially older ones, claim that we shouldn't do this, that you're going to ruin the transmission if you flush it. That is not true. I've heard technicians say you're going to push all that fluid. When you're pressurizing that fluid, you're going to wash all that stuff off the clutch packs, or you're going to put debris in the valve body. The problem with it, if that transmission's in good shape, to begin with, you're not going to hurt anything. If it's not in good shape, and you put new fluid in it, is what we talked about before, and then fluid takes away that old clutch material, and then it doesn't work. The transmission wasn't in good shape to begin with, and it wasn't going to last much longer. Plus, the fluid exchanger is not pressurizing that fluid any more than it already is. Most transmissions' line pressure at idle is going to be at least 60 pounds. That fluid exchanger is not going to pressurize that system any more than it already is. And with a fluid exchanger or flush machine, you can get a complete change of fluid. So you can get all the old stuff out and the new stuff in. And we'll walk through kind of some steps here in a bit when we talk about our fluid flush machines and how to do that. On when we change the fluid, you see many manufacturers that say 100,000 miles under normal conditions. Again, as I said earlier, you're seeing more and more that aren't even given a recommended fluid time interval. Some recommend a fluid change at 50,000 miles. My personal opinion, if you're not, and this is something I've used for a long time, and I've went through a lot of vehicles that have worked very well, and this is in the shop that I worked at, this is the intervals we used to always go with. If it has non-synthetic fluid, so most of your older transmissions up through your 4 speeds, many of those had non-synthetic fluid. A normal transmission change would probably be done at 50,000 miles. If you're under severe conditions, which we'll talk about in the next slide, like towing, real congested traffic, stop and go, which we really don't see much around here, but definitely in a lot of gravel or towing situations, we would knock that down to 30,000 miles or 35,000 miles. Maybe even less than that, if you're regularly hauling a horse trailer a few times a week or something like that, you might even knock it down to 25,000 miles. That would be on non-synthetic fluid. On synthetic fluid, which most of them are nowadays, then 100,000 miles under normal conditions, probably acceptable. In most conditions, that's all you're going to need. If you get in more severe conditions, then we knock it down to 50,000 miles. Again, if it's severe conditions, you might even knock it down to 35,000 miles. You kind of have to know what your customer does with their vehicle. And we also want to look at the fluid condition too. If you've changed the fluid at one point, now we're at 40,000 miles later and you're checking the fluid and it looks pretty brown, you know that you probably want to service that a little more often than 50,000 miles. That customer might just be running that vehicle a little harder, or you might want to check the temperature on that transmission, because sometimes you can get coolers that are partially plugged, so the transmission runs hotter than it should under normal conditions, and that breaks down the fluid. So that's something you need to be aware of. But this 100,000 miles and 50,000 miles, that would be fine under normal and severe conditions on a synthetic, but I would cut that down if we're talking on a non-synthetic fluid, which basically almost all your 3-speed transmissions, or even many of your 4-speed automatic overdrive transmissions, were still a standard fluid. Here's some severe driving conditions, frequently pulling a trailer, the heavy city traffic, this stop and go is really increases the temperature of your transmission, because as you know, we don't get lockup on our torque converters till we get up to closer to highway speeds. So there's a lot of slippage in that torque converter, and that creates heat, and a lot of stop and go tight traffic. Transmissions will run hotter. Hilly or mountainous conditions. If I lived out in the Rocky Mountains, I would make sure I had a shorter change interval on my transmission. Then commercial use, such as taxi or delivery service. These transmissions are really put through the ringer. Same with police or ambulance. So these would be severe conditions. So these would be in a synthetic fluid one. These would be at least every 50,000 miles. Depending on what the fluid looks like, it may be even more often than that. A non-synthetic fluid, these are 25 to 35,000 mile change intervals. Again, most transmission fluid we're dealing with on our newer vehicles are synthetics, and then a lot of times you can replace older transmission with synthetic, which it's more expensive, but I would try to recommend to your customer, if you can change out standard transmission fluid with a synthetic fluid, I would definitely recommend that. It would just increase the longevity of that transmission. So some basic steps when we're changing the filter on a transmission pan, with a transmission pan. There are some transmissions that have spin-on oil filters. Allison in the GM vehicles, they have a spin-on filter, and then they have a filter under the pan. Usually that spin-on filter was all that you need to change in most of the intervals. That one in the pan was usually only time you changed that when repairs were made. So you would change that spin-on filter and then drain and refill the transmission, or flush it would be even best. I know Saturn there for a while, and some of their older ones had a spin-on filter. But as I said, a lot of your newer ones do not have a filter that you can change, or it's a filter in which you would have to open the case up to change the filter, which you wouldn't do that in a normal service. But if it has a filter and a pan you can bring down, or a filter you can screw off, then that's what you'd want to do. But this, for dropping the pan, replacing the filter, some steps. Obviously, you want to get it up in the air. If you have it on, if you have a hoist, get it up on the hoist. If you don't have a hoist, get it up on jacks. Jack it up in the air, put it on jack stands. Then decide, because when you drop that pan, as you'll see, if it doesn't have a drain plug, if it has a drain plug, obviously drain the pan with the drain plug. But if it doesn't have a drain plug, as you loosen bolts, that fluid is going to want to rush out of that pan. So you want to pick a direction, usually on the back side, which allows that fluid to rush out. Okay? And then you start loosening bolts. You take all the bolts out except the ones on the opposite side you want the pan to drop on. So if you want it to drop on the back side of the transmission, you take all the bolts off the back side and then start loosening the ones on the front. That allows the pan to drop down. You want to have a big drain pan under that. Like we have here at school, we have our regular drain pans, and then we got a big square, looks like a big square, a shallow funnel. That's to catch when we drain transmissions. Okay. Here's an example. You can see this is on a Chrysler vehicle where they've taken the pan bolts off on the sides and the back and left them on the front and allow that fluid to drain. You got to be careful because you might be loosening them and then all of a sudden it just gives and drops and you have a big gush of fluid coming out. This is why having one of those big square catch funnels or pans comes in very handy, because if you don't, you're almost always going to get some spill on the floor, and then that's cleanup you have to do. But once you drain the pan like that, and you kind of hold it with your hand, take the rest of the bolts out, and then lower the pan down, and then drain the pan, finish draining the transmission pan. Okay, and then we're going to remove the filter. Many filters just are held in by the O-ring of where they go up into the case. Okay, there are some that are bolted on. You'll have to figure out how it's connected, but take the old pan filter off and just set the new one on. Make sure that if it has an O-ring or a seal, that you replace that O-ring or seal. Make sure the old O-ring or seal isn't up in the transmission. Make sure you take the old one out, because sometimes they'll stick up in the case. And make sure if it's got bolted on filter that you torque those down to specs, because they're going through the valve body. If you can over torque them, and either in severe cases break the bolts or mistorque the valve body and actually warp it enough to where valves won't shift. Remember, there's only about 3 to 4 thousandths clearance between the valve and the bore of the valve body. Okay, and then we're going to inspect the pan magnet and even the filter. We're looking for debris in there, especially on the magnet. Small shavings of metal, as long as it's not excessive, say about size of a quarter, is not necessarily abnormal. Bigger chunks, bigger flakes, that's abnormal. A pretty common one that we used to do this was Chrysler Dodges, their rear-wheel drives, their overdrive units from their 4-speeds. This was the 45, 46 REs or RHs if they weren't electronic. Dodge used for a very long time. I mean, from late 80s up into the mid 2000s. It was not abnormal. You'd take a pan down and there'd be a quarter-sized pile of aluminum shavings. That was normal. They used to use aluminum housing for their planetary gears assembly, for their pinion gears. And that aluminum would wear. You just clean the pan out, put a new filter on, new fluid, and you're good to go. If it had large chunks or large shavings, large flakes, that's when you knew something was coming apart. Okay? So even if it has some small filings in it, not necessarily anything you need to be panicked about. But we're looking for larger chunks of metal as an indicator that maybe the transmission's failing. And we got to clean everything up once we inspect what's in the pan. And again, we use a new filter and O-ring and put everything back together. Here's just a picture of a filter where it's up in the transmission. This one happens to have a clip that helps hold up one end of it. They don't all have that. This is where we want to check our service information. Pay attention when we're pulling apart. and put things back together how they are supposed to go. If you don't, you could damage the transmission. If that filter, if you don't put a new seal in it, and it sucks up air while it's trying to suck fluid, you're going to get air cavitation. And we talked about hydraulics. It doesn't like air in hydraulics, and you're going to get low to no pressure, and we're going to burn up clutches. So make sure we put it all back together like we're supposed to. And here's just a picture where there's a magnet in many pans. Clean that magnet off. Look for large particles of metal. And then put your gasket on it. There are some vehicles, Chrysler was one of them, that the pan gasket was a sealer, an RTV sealer from the factory. Most of the time when you get transmission filter kits, it comes with a gasket. So you just clean that old sealer off and put a gasket in place. I do not recommend using sealer on transmission pans with gaskets. You run too high of a risk of getting that sealer down in the pan and plugging the filter. So if you have a gasket, use a gasket only. Don't use a sealer with it. So we've cleaned the oil pan, we've straightened any dents or damage to the pans, we've installed a new gasket on the pan, and then we're putting the pan back up in place, and we're hand tighten all the bolts, and then go back and tighten them to specs. Okay. Once we've gotten all the pan all in place, we've got the filter in place, we're going to make sure everything's cleaned up. We're going to then lower the vehicle, and then we're going to add fluid to it. And then we're going to go through our fluid check procedure that we went in our last lesson. And that's going to depend on the vehicle and the manufacturer, exactly how we check the fluid and what fluid we put in it. Make sure we're putting the proper fluid in it. Again, we don't want to put a standard fluid in where they're calling for a synthetic. We don't want to put a fluid recommended for a GM transmission in a Ford transmission. Okay, there are those multi-vehicle fluids, which I have no problem with, as long as they specifically say that that fluid will work in your transmission. Don't guess. If it doesn't say on the bottle or any material from the company that produces that fluid, if it doesn't say it'll work in your transmission or replace the fluid that should go in your transmission, then don't put it in. Okay? And then we obviously dispose of the old fluid. So we just got done talking about how we change the fuel transmission filter with the pan, put it all back together and refill it. This is where our exchange units, our flush machines come into play. I don't like to flush a transmission without replacing the filter if it's got a replaceable filter. There are many shops that do that. If it has a replaceable filter, my recommendation, replace the filter. You wouldn't replace engine oil without replacing that filter. Don't make the same mistake on a transmission. Now, there are some that don't have a replaceable filter, which that's fine. But if it has a replaceable filter, replace the filter, go through that procedure, put 3 or 4 quarts in it, depending on how much it recommends, and then go ahead and flush the transmission. Do a full fluid flush. It costs more for the customer to change the filter and flush it than just flushing it, but it is something I would definitely recommend to the customer. It increases the longevity of that transmission. If it doesn't have a filter, then it's nothing we have to worry about. Then we can hook up our fluid exchange units. On our fluid exchanger, here it says it usually uses a chemical to dissolve varnish and other deposits. Many times with these flush machines, there is an additive or chemical that you put into the transmission, run it for a little bit, and then flush that. Go ahead and flush the transmission. The idea is it helps clean varnish and stuff out. You don't necessarily have to do that. The key is to get new transmission in. The new transmission fluid should take care of any heavy deposits or varnish. So if your business, your employer wants you to do that with your flush machine, fine, but you don't necessarily have to do that. The new fluid should do the cleaning for you. And in a fluid exchange, we're taking the old fluid out and we're putting new fluid in. So we can get all the old fluid out. This is something you don't do with just a drain and refill. You can't get all the fluid out because you've got to have a way to pump the fluid through the transmission so we can get it all out of the torque converter. And we do that with transmission flushes. So a typical procedure, again, it's hard to say exactly how to do it because each machine is going to be a little different, and also manufacturers are going to be different. Many times on your older ones, hook the machine up, flush it through, hook everything back up, you're good to go. But on some of these newer ones, Ford Escape is one that just pops in my head, that it doesn't circulate any fluid to that converter through the cooler lines until the transmission gets up to operating temperature. So on those, you would have to drive it and give it up to temperature before you can put your flush machine. Or some flush machines have equipment on it to where it heats the fluid up and then it either bypasses that mechanism or it's used to warm the fluid so it will then circulate fluid through the cooler, because the way we hook these up is through the cooler lines on most flush machines. We unhook a cooler line, hook the transmission flush machine up in series. You're going to have multiple adapters on these flush machines to hook up to a variety of different transmissions and manufacturers. So that's where you kind of got to keep up to date on your flush machines. So you have the adapters needed, and you need to be aware of do they have check valves, temperature valves in the transmission cooler lines. Dodge for a long time had a check valve to where fluid would only run through one way. So if you hooked into the wrong cooler line, in the wrong way, and tried to push fluid the wrong direction on that check valve, it wouldn't work. So you need to be aware of your transmission, your vehicle you're working on. Does it have any check valves? Does it have any valves, temperature valves? And adjust accordingly. Fluid is added to the machine. Usually a couple more quarts than what the capacity is the best. A lot of companies or businesses, when they sell a flush for transmission, it's up to a certain amount of quarts. Like a shop I worked at, they had a set price for a transmission flush, and that included up to 12 quarts of fluid. So even if your transmission only takes 8, I'd put 12 quarts in there. That's what the customer's paying for. That way you make sure you're getting a full batch of fluid in. If it takes 12 quarts and you put 12 quarts in the machine, you're not necessarily going to get 100% fluid change. It's going to change it out, the vast majority of it out. But it's also going to mix a little bit as it's flushing through. Okay? That's why it's always best to put a couple more quarts than what the capacity is. Because as it mixes through, as it's exchanging the fluid, you make sure you get a full 100% fluid change. But in most cases, you want the transmission at operating temperature. The engine needs to be running. You turn the machine on. As the engine's running, it's pumping the old fluid out into the machine, and the machine is pumping new fluid in. This is how we exchange that fluid. Once this machine is done, and most machines will beep, have some way to tell you that it's done, you shut the vehicle off, you unhook the machine, you hook all your cooler lines back up, and then you check the fluid level like you would normally. Make sure it's back up to operating temperature. You just put in most cases, room temperature transmission fluid. So that's going to lower the overall temperature of the transmission. So you want to get the transmission back up to operating temperature and check your fluid level like you normally would to make sure you have the proper fluid level. Don't just assume that just because you flushed it, fluid level is going to be where it needs to be. Most of the cases it's not. So you need to check the fluid level before you send that vehicle out the door. Again, I recommend highly transmission fluid flushes. If you have a filter, change that also. If you don't have a filter, then this just is a great way of getting 100% fresh fluid back in your transmission. There are technicians, especially older technicians, that try to insist that this is bad on your transmission, but it is not. If you have a transmission in good shape, you're not going to hurt anything with a transmission service. Here is just an example where they've got the machine hooked up. As you can see, they've hooked into one line, just splice into where the line went into the transmission itself, using adapters, and then they can just circulate the fluid. Old fluid's going to be pumped into the machine, new fluid's going to be pumped back into the transmission. All right, part of transmission service on older transmissions might be band adjustments. Most newer transmissions, as a matter of fact, I can't think of any newer transmission that has an adjustable band. But as I always say in class, as soon as you say that for 100% truth, then a manufacturer comes out and makes you a liar. Okay? But for the most part, most newer transmissions do not have adjustable bands, but older ones do. And you would do this when you service the transmission. You would adjust the bands at the same time. That friction material wears on the band, and so it increases that clearance, which changes the timing and the quality of that shift. If you're looking at a basic adjustment, there's going to be that stud, if you remember from our internals, that anchor point where that bolt will screw in and out of the case. There will be a lock nut that's around that bolt that once you set it where it's supposed to be, you tighten that lock nut down against the case so that bolt doesn't screw in or out by itself. Okay? This is where we look up on our service manual where to set this. Most commonly what would happen is you'd loosen that lock nut, you would screw that band down, the adjustment nut down, until it was tight, usually to a set torque. Then you would back it off a certain amount of turns. It was all recommended in the book how many turns that was. Once you get that, and a lot of times it was like 1.5 turns or 1 3/4 turns, maybe 2 turns, that you back that off. Then you hold the adjusting bolt and then you tighten the lock down. That was the adjustment of the transmission. Most of them were on the outside of the case, like this one in the picture. Some of them, Chrysler's rear-wheel drive transmissions would have one band that you adjust from the case. Another band, when you took the pan off, took the filter out, there was another band in there that you would adjust from inside the transmission. Okay. Also, a lot of times on these band adjustments, a lot of times you would cheat that band a little tighter than what the book would call for, depending on how you wanted that to shift. That Chrysler rear-wheel drive transmission, Mr. Seaburn's diesel truck, that one's a pretty common one. If they called for, say, 1 3/4 adjustment, a lot of times we'd set that to 1 1/4 or 1.5 inches on that transmission. It gave that shift a little firmer shift. You don't always do it, but sometimes you would. But again, most transmission nowadays do not have band adjustments. But if they do have an adjustable band, and you can see that when you look up service procedures. If it has adjustable band, adjust those bands when we service the transmission. The next adjustment is our manual linkage. About the only time you want to actually adjust the manual linkage is if you're getting engagement problems. You're putting it in gear and it acts like you have to fiddle around with the shifter to actually get it to engage. Maybe it won't start in park, but it starts in neutral. That's when we need to look at our linkage adjustment on our shifter linkage. We got to make sure all our linkage is tight. Ford trucks were bad about where the cable went up and hooked to the linkage on the steering column. 2 bolts holding that arm on where the cable hooked up would get loose and you get a real sloppy shifter. You want to make sure all our cables, all our brackets for our cables are tight, and then most of the time there's a set procedure, and that's going to vary. You look it up in your service manual how to adjust this linkage. Again, misadjusted linkage can cause it not starting in park or neutral like it's supposed to, or starting in reverse or drive like it's not supposed to, or the manual valve does not get in the proper position, and we have trouble with engagement. Our transmission fluid is trying to get to the wrong passage, so we have problems with engagement procedure in our transmission. Again, we kind of went through this manual linkage adjustment. There's also a shift lock mechanism. Many transmissions, you have to have the brake pushed down before it comes out of park. A lot of times there's an adjustment on there. There's either an electronic solenoid that's operated by the brake switch, or there's actually another little cable that runs from your brake mechanism up to your shifter, where that cable's operated by a solenoid, which is operated by your solenoid or your brake switch, that pulls the cable that allows it to even come out of park. There's adjustments for that. There's adjustments a lot of times for your indicator, your reverse neutral drive indicator. there's adjustments to that. It's usually hooked, say, to your steering column or your shifter, your floor shifter, and there might be a little cable or something that when you put it in park, it shows park. You put it in reverse, your indicator says reverse. A lot of your newer ones, that's all electronic, operated off your pressure switch or your transmission range switch, so there's not an actual adjustment to that. Here you can see on this one where they're adjusting the shift lever, the manual shift linkage. Sometimes they tell you in park. A lot of times they'll tell you to put it in neutral. You have to release a tab. The cable goes into a certain position. Then you reinstall that tab, and that's adjusted. Always check for loose linkage before you make these adjustments. Rarely should it get out of adjustment. Usually it gets out of adjustment because linkage has gotten loose, or someone has done some repair on it and has got it out of adjustment that way. Here is a park reverse neutral drive indicator adjuster. This is on a Dodge, Ford, very similar. You can see where they're pointing. That's a housing. Just right below that, to your right a little bit, you can see a black cable with the white end on it, with a little steel copper cable coming out of that. That would go up and hook to a linkage on your shifter column, and that little cable would run the indicator on your dash. As you ran it through park, reverse, neutral, drive, then that cable would operate where the indicator would go. These would usually get broke because people would go to lower the steering column down, forget to unhook that cable, and they would break that cable or that housing. And then here's some shift lock mechanisms. They don't want you to put it in most of your vehicles for a very long time. They don't want you to be able to shift it out of park unless the brake pedal's on. There's usually some shift interlock system, and there's usually some sort of adjustment to that to keep that shifter, either floor shifter like this one or a steering column shifter, to keep that from coming out of park until you've pushed down on the brake. All right, the next adjustment is a throttle valve cable adjustment. There's going to be a video of this I'm going to put up. Make sure you look at this. It's going to vary between vehicle manufacturers, but if you remember our throttle valve cable, we have a cable running to a valve in the transmission, and that told the transmission what kind of load the vehicle was under. You open the throttle wide open, it would pull on this cable, which would move your throttle valve in your transmission and tell the transmission you're under a heavier load, and they would adjust shift timing. Where they have the red pin is kind of the housing. There was some way that you would push a level button, pull up a tab, and an inner housing would move in the outer housing. Where the red mark is your inner housing. Right off to the left on the other side of the bracket is your outer housing. That inner housing would slide in and out usually of the outer housing, and that would be adjust the position of the cable. This was very important. Always double check this adjustment whenever you're having shifting problems. If the transmission is shifting just fine, you shouldn't have to do this as part of a service. But if you have any sort of shifting complaints, shifting problems, or any time you have to have this cable unhooked or removed, or say it's broke, or say you look under there and it's unhooked, hook it back up, check the adjustment. On some transmissions, if this is unhooked, you can burn the transmission up very quickly because the throttle pressure is so low, it lowers the apply pressure to your clutches and bands and actually burns the clutches up. It can even do that if it's out of adjustment. So if it's a non-electric transmission, especially if you're having shifting concerns, look for the throttle valve cable and make adjustments that need to be made. On transmission overhaul, not going to get into great detail on this. That's why I put video up. There's so many different types of transmissions and how they're put together. To go into each specific detail would not be plausible. So I'm just going to go through some key points. When we're disassembling a transmission, before we get into disassembly, real quick, talking about taking a transmission in and out or transaxle, look at your service information, see how they recommend it. But what I recommend is get into a normal routine, a normal pattern in how you take it out. What I do is, first thing before I lift it on a hoist, I take everything up top that can be taken off and that needs to be taken off if I can. Then I lift it up, and then I usually start from one end and go to the other end. And then when I put it back together, I do everything in the reverse order. If you have a basic routine, how you get a transmission in and out, and this can go for any sort of repair that you do on a vehicle. If you have the same routine that you do every time, and you do it the same way every time, there's less chance that you forget stuff. Bolts, forget to tighten stuff, forget to do certain adjustments. And with a routine, you can go faster. You have the same basic routine, you can get it down, you can go faster. And I've always said, if you want to do it right and you want to do it fast. Doing it right keeps you from getting fired, and doing it fast makes you more money. So if you can get any sort of routine on your repairs, especially taking them in and out transmission or engines, big jobs, it speeds it up and you can do it faster and make more money. Same thing goes with overhaul. Do it the same basic way. On transmissions, there's usually a routine that you kind of have to go by to pull it apart in certain ways. But some key points on disassembly. It's important to make sure we look for any visual, when we take it all apart, visually inspect all our components. But usually with disassembly, I take everything apart off on the outside that doesn't need to be on there. Sensors, brackets, if it has a removable bell housing, I take that off. If it has a removable tail housing, I take that off. Any sort of speedometer gears, anything that doesn't need to be on there and can easily be taken off, I take all those outside components off first. Okay, then I start taking it apart. I'm taking the pan off, and then I'm starting to take filters and valve bodies, and then I tear down into the internal part of it. Okay, but we're visually looking for inspecting all our components. We're looking for damage, wear, or excessive play in our planetary gear set. Our little pinion gears in our carrier of our sun gears, if they have too much up and down or in play, then we need to replace them. And most of the time the service manual will tell you how much in play you should have. Experience from rebuilding enough transmissions will tell you that is normal, that is excessive. But most service manuals will give you a spec on that. We're looking for also our pump. Is there excessive play in our gears? Is there excessive wear in our pump? We're looking for failed components. There's a reason we're taking this apart. We've diagnosed it. We've said the reason it's not shifting is this clutch pack is bad, or the reason it's not shifting is this band is slipping. Something like that. When we tear it apart, we want to verify that our diagnosis was correct. If it wasn't, but we still found faulty components, what could have made this component fail? All things we're looking for when we're tearing apart a transmission. We're looking for excessive bushing or bearing wear or damage. We're inspecting the valve body. Do we have stuck valves in the valve body? Do we have a separator plate that there's an accumulator piston that broke and damaged the separator plate? Check valve, check ball that's been wearing on the plate. Now the hole that's it's supposed to be covering up is all worn out and the check ball doesn't seal. These are all things we're inspecting as we're taking this transmission, disassembling this transmission. Key points during reassembly. Soak your clutches and bands in automatic transmission fluid and soak them in the fluid that the transmission calls for. If it calls for a synthetic fluid, don't soak it in a Dextron 3 non-synthetic fluid. Soak it in the fluid that it's supposed to be in. Clutches and bands. You only have to soak it for really about 10 or 15 minutes. But if you set it in there overnight, it's not going to hurt anything. Okay? Or even if it sets in that fluid for several days, not going to hurt anything. But you only need to really have to soak it for 10 or 15 minutes. Okay? Just so these clutches don't start dry. They're starting with fluid on them. We're going to air check our clutch packs. We put a clutch pack together, put new piston seals and disc steels and fibers in there. We're going to apply air to it. Sometimes it's right to the drum assembly that the clutches go in. Sometimes the drum has to go into, say the pump, and we find the proper port on the pump, and we watch these clutch packs get applied. So make sure they work, and then we check clutch pack clearances. On some older ones, that was a simple feeler gauge. We're going to look in the book. We're going to look up the information of how much clearance they want in their clutch packs. Most clutches are 30 to 60 thousandths worth of clearance. Most of your newer ones, especially anything that has a wave plate, the best way is with a dial indicator. I put a video up on how to check clutch pack clearance with a dial indicator. You're applying the clutch with an air, it applies, it moves the dial indicator a certain amount, and that's how much clearance is in that clutch pack. Okay? Too tight a clearance, and the clutch discs are going to not release, and they're going to try and stay engaged, and they're going to slip and burn up. Too much clearance, it's going to take too much pressure, too much movement of that piston to get it applied. So it's going to get long slide shifts, and they're going to slip too much and eventually burn up. So clutch pack clearance is important. Any damaged bearings, washers, or bushings, replace them. If this is a customer's vehicle and you want to warranty that for any length of time, it's best just to put all new bearings and bushings and washers in there. If it's something of your own or something you're just trying to put a few seals in and get back on the road, then maybe just replace the output bushing and the bushing in the pump. But But in reality, if you're going to do it for a customer, it's best to replace all your bushings, your bearings, and washers that are in the transmission. You're going to replace, my recommendation, if you have an electronic shift transmission and it has any sort of mileage on it, replace all your electrical solenoids. You are asking for trouble to charge a customer a bunch of money to rebuild their transmission, put it on the road, and then an electrical solenoid with 200,000 miles on it fails a month later, and they ruin a transmission, or they come back very upset that this transmission that they just spent $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 on for you to replace is not working properly. Replace the electrical solenoids, okay? And then when we're all done assembly, part of this reassembly is checking the in-play. And a lot of time, most of the time, it's just the front in-play of your input shaft. A lot of times there's an output shaft in-play. Too much in-play where these drums can move, or shaft, input and output shaft can move too far in or out, can cover and uncover passages and lead to fluid leakage, which means low pressure, which means clutches and bands aren't applied properly, which means a damaged transmission. That's not something you want to do right after you rebuilt it. All these specs should be in your service manual. How to check in play, what specifications there are to it. Make sure that you watch these videos that I put up. That's really going to help you understand how to do all this. Again, this has been something we've done in class. I would have spent at least a week on, if not more, going through rebuilding the transmissions. So that kind of concludes our lesson on transmission service and repair. Again, most shops, you're going to do the service, you're going to do repairs on the transmission, like maybe output shaft seal, or maybe you replace some solenoids in the valve body, maybe a valve body itself. That'll be done in a lot of shops, but most shops don't do the rebuilding. But again, if you can get in there and take apart a transmission and put back together, if you know how to do that, you have a better grasp of how that transmission works, and that's gonna lead to better diagnosis. Remember, if we want to know how to fix something, we've got to know how it works. Having one apart helps you understand that. So again, watch our videos, because this is the only PowerPoint in this section. So watch those videos, get an understanding of how this system works. And then our next section is we're going to cover three transmissions that aren't like your traditional transmissions and transaxles: the CVT and the dual clutch transmissions, how those constructed, and then Honda's automatic and Saturn's automatic transaxles. They use clutches, multi-disc clutch packs, but they don't use planetary gear sets. They use shafts and helicut gears, and we'll talk about those in the last section. And then after that will be our final, and our lectude will be due at that point. Again, make sure you're watching your videos, make sure you're understanding what's going on, and make sure you call me or email me if you have any questions. Okay?